The 1968 Chicano Student Walkouts for Education Equality by Sadie Daniel, Samantha Sandhouse, Von Mai, Sinchen Ren, and Winnie Lau. Many people know about the civil rights movement during the 1960s in which black folks fought for and accomplished greater equality for themselves. But did you know that during the 1960s, oppressed communities around the world organized themselves so that collectively they could evoke revolutionary demands for change? Specifically, in East Los Angeles in 1968, Chicano students organized themselves to bring attention and demand change for education equality through massive school walkouts. At its height, over 15,000 students across LA participated in walkouts or blowouts to demonstrate their dissatisfaction with the educational structure. These protests had a massive impact on the Chicano student movement and the Chicano movement in general, and inspired Mexican American students across the country to conduct similar forms of protest to fight for education equality. So, what was their purpose? Why did the students initially organize the walkouts?
The educational conditions for Mexican American students were inarguably oppressive. White Americans with power to control the educational system viewed Mexican Americans only as a source of labor, so the education system funneled Mexican students into low paying labor jobs rather than encouraging higher education. In the segregated community of East Los Angeles, 1 out of 4 students graduated from high school. Low graduation rates led to extreme rates of poverty and unemployment. Unemployment for Mexican Americans was double the national average, and the average wages for Mexicans in LA were a full third less than the average citizen. Teachers and institutions neglected the students and projected shame of their heritage and culture onto them, which created a toxic learning environment for students and encouraged them to leave high school.
Harry Gamboa recalled that in the 1950s, when he was a young student, he was the only monolingual Spanish-speaking student in the classroom, and that the teacher forced him to wear a cone-shaped hat that labeled Spanish until he learned to speak English. This act of discrimination not only demonstrates the assimilationist culture of the school system for Mexican students to learn English, but also that the American school system portrayed Spanish culture as inferior to being American. This treatment of Mexican American students was reflected in all of the educational system, consistently oppressing and stereotyping students, treating them as less than their white counterparts and disencouraging students' quest for higher education.
Families had been voicing their outrage against the school's discrimination for years. By the time students began to voice their concerns to one another. After some deliberation, students conducted a peer survey to show the school district their frustration for the absence of support compared to their white peers. The school board essentially ignored the students' demands. In response to this lack of action, the Garfield High School Strike Committee planned and led the fight for their education equality through student-organized walkouts. On May 5, 1968, at 9 a.m., as participants walked around the building signaling to blow out, everyone participating and marched out of their schools. 4,000 students walked out of 5 different schools that first morning. As the days went by, the crowd grew to over 10,000 students from 16 different schools. Mexican power organizations such as the Brown Berets joined the students to provide security from the police. During their protests, students chanted out empowering messages like Chicano power, gave speeches about the issues they were facing, and outlined the goals of their protests.
Their overarching goal was the improvement of the current educational opportunities through a more diverse educational system and more acknowledgement for the Chicano community. Students demanded bilingual instruction, Mexican American history courses, and to corporal punishment, more Mexican American teachers and counselors, as well as Chicano representatives in the school board, and for teachers and administrators to provide equal access and recognition for Mexican American students. Thus, the Chicano student movement began. Inspired by the efforts of the students in East LA, thousands of Mexican American students around the country held their own walkouts and presented similar demands for education reform. The urban movement of the Chicano people would continue into the 1970s, and eventually students would achieve nationally installed bilingual instruction and the increased hiring of Mexican teachers. After a generation of institutional oppression, the persistent, self-determined efforts of the Chicano students brought upon unprecedented progress for the education of all oppressed people. And here are credits to our sources.